It's been a little over a month since Death Stranding launched, and in that time I've managed to clock up 138 hours into it. That's more hours in a month than a full year of playtime for pretty much any title I've played since maybe Skyrim back in 2011. Now, I've always found that in recent years, no matter the game, I'm only ever able to put so many hours into it before I need to take some time away. That goes for The Witcher 3, Red Dead 2, or even MGS 5. All games that as a kid I'd have been able to sit down and put a crazy amount of hours into in a short space of time. I'd always attributed not being able to do that anymore to just adult shit, but that hasn't been an issue at all for Death Stranding. I've always found the time to pick it back up. It has totally sucked me in, and I'm always just saying to myself, just one more delivery before I call it a night. For me, it's been one of those rare releases that recaptures the magic of being a kid and having a game that you're so into, you wake up and all you want to do is play it from sun up till sundown. Where you just immerse yourself into it, pore over its lore and comb every inch of its world. Special games like that come along only so often, and for me, that has been Death Stranding. It has an almost addictive and satisfying gameplay loop that keeps me coming back for more, traversing the world in the myriad of ways available to the player. From the start, when you have hardly any gear or equipment at your disposal except for a few ropes and ladders, where Sam stumbles at the smallest of inclines or on rocky ground, all the way up to the end game when you're hurtling over mountains at breakneck speeds, making deliveries in minutes that would have taken hours in the early game. The satisfaction of setting up those routes by placing down your ladders and ropes, creating bridges over ravines or rivers, the stunning vistas and eerily barren landscapes, accompanied by nothing more than the sound of the wind and the occasional rambling from Sam, all intermittently punctuated by the melancholic and eerie sounds of low roar. It's those moments where you come across a remote timefall shelter with some kind stranger placed down that you desperately needed to repair the cargo you were hauling from one side of the map to the other, giving them a few likes to let them know that their time and effort was appreciated, and in turn putting down your own structures in the hope that another Sam out there will get use out of it in a moment of need, and getting some likes in return as well. All of it comes together to create an experience that is just serene and almost cathartic. I find myself delivering cargo for hours at a time without realizing just how long has passed. And one of my earliest impressions of the game was that the criticisms of it being a walking simulator were in fact totally on point. But while that term is thrown around negatively to paint it as boring or tedious, it is for me anything but. For Death Stranding, walking simulator translates to a number of different mechanics, all coming together to make an engaging and rewarding gameplay loop. So when moving through areas, you need to scan the terrain that's in front of you. Blue areas are safe, yellow means the terrain is tougher going but passable with a bit of caution, and red means dangerous terrain that is very difficult to pass, potentially impossible without the aid of ropes, ladders or some other structure. This applies to river crossings as well, the colours indicating how deep the water is or how fast the current's flowing, and Sam's movement speed and balance are all affected by the weight and distribution of the cargo on his back. The cargo, which can be manually placed, or by using the Auto Arrange function in the cargo management menu, you can optimize the placement, distributing everything evenly, minimizing the chance of taking a fall on uneven or steep terrain, potentially damaging yourself, your cargo, or stressing out poor BB. When planning your deliveries, you need to take a look at your map and figure out what obstacles are between you and your destination, tilting it to see the contours of the land, looking for re-entrance that will allow you to summit hills and mountains, or locate gorges that will help you to sneak around and avoid mule territories. Or you can use it to locate rivers and their potential crossings. Once you connect a region to the chiral network, you'll also be able to see more player structures, which also helps when planning routes. Later in the game, you gain access to weather forecasts, allowing you to predict 30 minutes in advance where there'll be a downpour of timefall, helping you to avoid its damaging effects on your cargo, or to predict where you might run into BTs. This all informs you on how to best draw your route through the terrain. Or, if that sort of planning and micromanaging isn't your cup of tea, then simply draw a line from A to B and go as close to how the crow flies as possible, dealing with obstacles as they crop up instead. Which is actually also rewarding in the form of extra points upon completion of a delivery, depending on how much you deviate from the shortest distance between the 2 points. Something I didn't actually discover until later in the game, once all my usual delivery routes had been established between the outposts. Cutting across the map and mountain ranges in as close to a straight line as I could, when I'd not tread any paths or laid down any ropes or ladders, was a fresh new challenge 100 hours into the game. Early on, you'll find yourself stocking up on ropes and ladders to help you get to your destination, but as the game opens up, you'll often find that other Sams will have added their equipment into the world, saving you from using your own. And you'll notice that they even tread desire lines into the landscape, indicating the routes that are most travelled. In the snow, this actually makes it easier and quicker to get around, because instead of wading through knee-high snowdrifts, you can move through ploughed paths much faster. In rocky areas, wider and more trodden paths will actually erode away some of the rocks, creating flatter, wider paths to help when traversing on foot or when using vehicles. In most open world games, the traversal of the map is a means to an end. Leave point A to go to point B, and when you arrive you will complete a task such as fighting an outpost of enemies or clearing a dungeon before moving on to point C, or even back to the starting point if it's a fetch quest. The game's primarily gameplay loops, for the most part, take place at these points, and while Death Stranding has more than its fair share of fetch quests, it flips that concept entirely on its head and turns the spaces between the points into the main focus of the gameplay. It makes the seemingly empty open world come alive with challenges. There's no need to populate your world with superfluous content like copy and pasted enemy outposts when the world itself is more than just a stage but is a playground. All of these mechanics come together to create a very fun and gamey approximation of what actual hiking and land navigation is like. Now, hiking and map reading are two of my hobbies outside of gaming, so naturally the game feels pretty fine-tuned to my own personal tastes and interests. And therein, I think, lies the first issue with Death Stranding. I'm very conscious that it's not for everyone. Not in a pretentious kind of way where, I don't mean to say that people just won't understand it. It's not for everyone because it really ticks a few very specific boxes that some people like me are going to get on board with right away. Then there are the players who perhaps soldiered on through to Chapter 3 where the game picks up momentum in terms of both story and gameplay and decided that perhaps it's a game they do actually enjoy. I imagine there are going to be some people who will get past that point and decide that no, it really isn't for them. And there will obviously be people who think that from the outset without needing to pick it up, and that's fine too. Death Stranding knows completely what type of game it wants to be, and it doesn't try to pander to as many tastes as it can. When you compare it to something that came out recently too, like Ghost Recon Breakpoint, which is trying to appeal to the fans of a bunch of different genres, from RPG to looter shooter to milsim and survival, the result is a mess of a game that has an identity crisis, and Death Stranding just does not have this issue. Along with the storytelling, the combat and stealth is probably where that MGS DNA is the most apparent. Much like Metal Gear, you're heavily encouraged to avoid contact where possible. The enemy camps are placed in such a way that they often cover entire valley floors or slap bang in the middle of a main throughway, which makes circumnavigating them pretty challenging and can add a good bit of time on top of your deliveries. Much like the terrain itself, the enemies in the game act as another obstacle standing between you and your destination. This naturally encourages you to get a bit sneaky, especially because you can quickly find yourself outnumbered and outgunned very rapidly. So you are encouraged to avoid contact where possible. Now, I've tried to not unfairly compare Death Stranding to Metal Gear when playing around with the stealth mechanics, but it was at times difficult to refrain from for obvious reasons. But if you're coming into this expecting MGS with a hiking sim tacked on, you'll probably be disappointed. However, I think most MGS fans who come to Death Stranding for Death Stranding will be satisfied with the stealth and combat. Now, unlike Metal Gear, where the benefits of a non-lethal approach are mostly relegated to the results screen at the end of the game in the form of a higher rank, in Death Stranding it's actually woven into the lore. Bodies turn necro 48 hours after death, at which point contact with the beach thing causes an annihilation event called a void out, and that has the potential to wipe out entire cities. In terms of gameplay, leaving a trail of bodies in your wake and not disposing of them at an incinerator results in a game over. To this end, non-lethal is generally the best approach if you don't want a bunch of dead body admin to take care of, derailing your deliveries. There is actual tangible consequence for lethal action in this game. With that said though, the shooting mechanics are smooth and intuitive, and the experience that Kojima Productions has gained over the years from MGS4 and MGS5 when crafting their shooting mechanics has put Death Stranding's combat in a great place. So going loud and getting spotted, deliberately or otherwise, is really a chore. And for a game that's designed to be about connecting people and exploration, not so much the shooty, it sure does give you a lot of rather fun sticks to beat your enemies around the head with. Sam isn't equipped with the traditional moveset of a stealth action game. There's no cover system, no going prone. You're heavily reliant on the sparsely scattered long grass and rocks, as well as using the rolling terrain to keep yourself hidden from the enemy's line of sight, which is actually pretty far and complements the expansive open world nicely, keeping things challenging. To fans of Metal Gear or other similar stealth-based shooters, this will all feel very familiar, and I think it should scratch that stealth action itch. Combat with BTs consists of a game of hot and cold using your Odra deck, the spotting device that you have. And spotting the BTs requires you to stay completely still, and I didn't actually realise this until about halfway through the game. Initially I wasn't sure what the conditions were for outlining them, but once I realised it was to just stop moving, avoiding BTs got a whole lot easier, and in the end game, when you've figured out their detection ranges and even their locations, because as far as I can tell, they also have predetermined spawn locations, the curtain gets pulled back a little bit and they're nowhere near as intimidating as they were at the start. I think when Death Stranding makes its way to PC, one mod I'm going to keep my eye out for the most is one that makes the BT stealth and combat a touch more challenging. Kojima talked about this game being in a new genre of its own, something totally different, and while he went on to clarify that he may not have been the first to make a stealth game, he certainly propelled the genre to popularity, and he noted the same of Death Stranding's Strand genre. While asymmetrical online multiplayer isn't anything new, having been a part of the Dark Souls series, he's hoping to make it more of a staple in games moving forward. I assume perhaps he means more the cooperative and community building aspects of Death Stranding, working together to build and progress towards a shared goal. And this really was one of the standout parts of the game for me. There's just something really satisfying about putting down a structure and knowing it has a chance of showing up in someone else's world and being of help to them, getting the notifications to say that someone's been using your bridge, or been in your safe house, or walked a path that you wore into the landscape. At one point in the story, you're required to backtrack east through the entire game world after spending hours and hours moving west. None of your items will be in the world during this portion of the game for arbitrary plot reasons, making you entirely reliant on the structures and vehicles that other players have left behind. It really hammers this point home and was possibly my favourite part of the game. The urgency of the story, the changed aesthetic of the landscape, and your complete dependence on other players, all of whom are on the same journey as you, it was the perfect exclamation point on this asymmetric online system and underpinned the theme of connection and cooperation beautifully for me. In closing, Death Stranding has absolutely been my game of the year, and has been the perfect game to close off the decade. It has a unique quality to it that intrigues me and keeps me coming back for more. It feels fresh and new, while at the same time being familiar, and reiterates to me why I love Hideo Kojima games. It's the interesting and outlandish characters and their journeys, the grandiose world building, the engaging gameplay that has been designed and polished to a mirror sheen. It's the perfectly crafted music and art direction, the weird, wonderful, and at times funny and even sad story. It has all the hallmarks of a Hideo Kojima game, an assurance of quality that is being called into question in recent years, due in part to the sometimes mixed reception of the latter Metal Gears, which might have been a limiting factor in Kojima and Company's creativity by virtue of being sequels to games that were new and original 15 to 20 years ago. By being tied to the intricate lore, but also the expected iterations on gameplay that I think can only be taken so far within the parameters of stealth, this would have eventually made it harder and harder to reinvent the wheel each time you want to get creative with gameplay and story. Kojima may dream of making movies, but he and his team truly understands what makes a fun game, and having a blank creative slate to let their imaginations run away, I think has allowed them to create something truly inspired and much needed in today's current gaming landscape.